Maggie Williams, a 72-year-old retired teacher, had a quiet life in the small town of Willow Creek. Known for her wit and kindness, she was loved by her neighbors. But Maggie's real partner was Scout, her loyal German shepherd, a retired police canine. One autumn evening, under a canopy of orange and gold leaves, Maggie decided to take Scout for their usual evening walk. The streets were peaceful, the air crisp. Maggie savored these moments, her footsteps crunching softly on the fallen leaves as the world wound down for the night. Scout walked close beside her, his ears twitching at every faint rustle, his presence a comforting constant. As they turned on a Sycamore Lane, Maggie's peace was interrupted. Ahead, under the dim glow of an old street lamp, three young men stood clustered together. Their laughter was sharp and carried on the night breeze, mingling with the faint hum of distant crickets. Maggie's steps slowed. There was something about their stance, the way they leaned into one another, that set her on edge. Scout felt it too. His body tensed, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Maggie rested a reassuring hand on his head, but her eyes stayed fixed on the men. "Evening, gentlemen," Maggie called out, her voice calm though her heart began to quicken. The tallest of the three stepped forward, his features shadowed, but his posture cocky. "Evening, ma'am," he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Out late, aren't you? Dangerous time for a stroll." Scout shifted, moving slightly ahead of Maggie. His growl deepened, a clear warning. One of the other men chuckled and nudged his friend. "Relax, Grandma. We're just being friendly." His smirk widened, but his eyes carried a sharpness that made Maggie's skin crawl. Maggie stood her ground, her hand steady on Scout's leash. She'd lived long enough to recognize when trouble was brewing. The way they carried themselves, half laughing, half predatory, sent a chill down her spine. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to appear composed. "Scout and I are just out for our walk," she said evenly. "We won't trouble you." "Trouble us," the tallest man repeated, feigning offense. "Oh no, ma'am. We were just thinking maybe you shouldn't be out alone at this hour. Anything could happen, you know." Scout barked sharply, cutting through the man's words. The sound echoed in the quiet street, making one of the men flinch. The leader's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, his bravado returning. "Nice dog," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "But I don't think he's much of a match for us." Maggie felt the weight of the moment settling over her. She gripped Scout's leash tighter, her heart pounding, but she refused to show fear. Whatever was about to happen, she wasn't facing it alone. Scout, her steadfast companion, was ready for anything. And Maggie knew one thing for certain. These men had no idea who they were about to tangle with. Maggie took a steady breath, her mind racing for options as the three men closed in. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her grip on Scout's leash didn't falter. The man with the knife twirled it lazily in his hand, his grin widening as if he were toying with prey. "Hand it over, lady," he demanded again, jerking his chin toward her handbag. The blade glinted under the faint light, sharp enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. Scout growled deeper, a low rumble that seemed to echo off the buildings around them. His body was coiled, ready for action, his eyes locked onto the man with predatory focus. Maggie knew that Scout, though retired, hadn't forgotten his training. He was waiting for her signal, poised to protect her at all costs. "Look," Maggie began, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "You don't want to do this. You'll end up in worse trouble than you bargained for." The tallest man snorted, his bravado masking a flicker of hesitation. "Worse trouble," he mocked. "Lady, the only trouble here is you being out alone with that mutt. Now, hand it over before things get ugly." The man with the knife stepped forward, pointing the blade in her direction. Maggie's pulse thundered in her ears, but her voice didn't waver. "You should walk away while you can," she said, her eyes narrowing. But they didn't. The man lunged forward, the knife slicing through the air. But before he could get close, Scout moved. With a speed that startled even Maggie, Scout leapt forward, teeth bared, and clamped down on the man's wrist with precision. The knife clattered to the ground, skidding across the pavement. "What the?" The man yelped, struggling against Scout's iron grip. His bravado dissolved into panic as he fell to his knees. Scout released his wrist, but didn't back down, standing over him and snarling, daring him to try again. The other two men froze, their confidence wavering. One took a cautious step back, his hands raised. "Hey, we don't want any trouble," he stammered, but his friend grabbed him by the arm. "Shut up," he hissed, though his voice betrayed his fear. "I warned you," Maggie said, her tone sharp. She kept her stance firm, her eyes meeting theirs with unwavering resolve. "Scout doesn't take kindly to threats." The tallest man clenched his fists, glancing between Maggie and Scout. "He's just a dog," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. He reached for a heavy piece of wood lying nearby. Scout's ears flicked back, and he barked, a sharp, commanding sound that reverberated in the still night. The man froze mid-motion, his courage draining away. "Leave," Maggie said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Now, while you still can." For a moment, the street was silent except for Scout's growl. Then, slowly, the men began to back away, their false bravado crumbling. Scout didn't move, his gaze locked on them until they turned and disappeared into the shadows. Maggie knelt beside Scout, her hands shaking as she stroked his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy." Scout stood over the man he had pinned, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. His sharp eyes darted to the second man, who had finally shaken off his shock and foolishly decided to charge at Maggie. Scout didn't hesitate. With a powerful leap, he intercepted the attacker mid-stride, knocking him off balance and slamming him onto the ground. The man cried out, his bravado now replaced with pure panic. "Call him off! Get this dog off me!" he shrieked, flailing against Scout's unyielding weight. Maggie stood firm, her hands steady on Scout's leash. "Not until you boys learn some manners," she said, her voice unwavering and firm. Her calm composure belied the storm of adrenaline coursing through her. The third man, realizing he was now alone and facing the formidable pair, panicked. He turned on his heel and bolted down the street, thinking he could escape the nightmare unfolding. But Scout was faster. With agility that belied his age, Scout darted after him, cutting off his path with a precision born of years of training. The man stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving as he stared at the imposing figure of Scout blocking his escape. He looked around wildly, realizing there was nowhere to run. Scout herded him back like a sheepdog corralling a stray, his growl serving as an unspoken command to comply. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of a passerby, who called the police. Maggie, still holding Scout's leash, glanced down at the two subdued men sprawled on the ground. "You thought you'd picked an easy target," she said, shaking her head. "Big mistake." The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police approached. Flashing lights illuminated the scene, painting it in red and blue hues. The men, now trembling under Scout's watchful gaze, looked up at the arriving officers with a mix of relief and resignation. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, stepping out of the patrol car. His partner followed, surveying the situation with a raised eyebrow. Maggie stepped forward, keeping Scout by her side. "These three decided they wanted to cause trouble," she explained, her voice calm but resolute. "Scout here made sure they didn't get far." The officer's eyes widened as he recognized Scout. "Is that Scout?" he asked, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I thought he retired years ago." Maggie nodded, giving Scout a proud pat. "Retired, maybe, but he hasn't forgotten a thing." As the officers cuffed the men and began loading them into the patrol cars, one of them muttered, "We didn't sign up for this." "That dog's a monster." Maggie chuckled softly. "Not a monster," she corrected. "A hero." Scout wagged his tail slightly as the officers thanked Maggie and assured her they'd take it from here. She glanced down at her loyal companion and smiled. "Good work, Scout. Let's go home." The commotion began to fade as the police efficiently subdued the three men and secured the scene. Scout, ever watchful, stayed close to Maggie, his sharp eyes following every movement. Despite the tension that had gripped the night, Maggie felt a sense of calm now that the danger had passed. One of the officers crouched to get a closer look at Scout. His face lit up with recognition. "Well, I'll be," he said, a grin spreading wide. "If it isn't Scout, the legend himself. You still got it, old boy." Maggie couldn't help but smile, pride radiating from her. "He never lost it," she replied, giving Scout an affectionate pat. The officer chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. "I remember working with this guy back in the day," the officer continued, addressing his younger partner. "Best K9 we ever had. Took down suspects twice his size. Always knew exactly what to do." The younger officer's eyebrows shot up. "This is the Scout? The one from the training videos?" "The very same," the older officer confirmed. He gave Scout a respectful nod. "Good to see you're still keeping the streets safe, buddy." As the officers loaded the subdued men into the patrol cars, Maggie observed the shift in their demeanor. The once cocky troublemakers were now subdued and trembling, casting wary glances at Scout. One of them muttered under his breath, That dog's not normal." Maggie couldn't resist a small smirk. "Scout isn't just any dog," she said calmly. "And maybe next time, you'll think twice before picking a fight with someone who's got a real partner by their side." The officers assured Maggie that the men would face charges and thanked her for her bravery. As they drove away, Maggie turned to Scout. "Well, that's enough excitement for one night, don't you think?" she said, her voice warm despite the lingering adrenaline. Scout wagged his tail, his tongue lolling out in a rare moment of levity. Together, they began the short walk back home. The streets felt quieter now, more secure. Maggie's steps were lighter, and the tension that had knotted her shoulders began to ease. When they arrived at her cozy house on the corner of Maple Street, Maggie unlocked the door and stepped inside, Scout at her heels. The familiar warmth of her home wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. She set her handbag on the table and crouched to give Scout a heartfelt hug. "You did good tonight, Scout," she whispered. "Better than good. You were incredible." Scout gave a soft woof, as if acknowledging her praise, and padded over to his favorite spot by the fireplace. He circled twice before lying down, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but still alert. As Maggie sat down with a cup of tea, she reflected on the night's events. She'd always known Scout was special, but tonight, he'd reminded her just how extraordinary he truly was. In a world that could sometimes feel uncertain, having Scout by her side was all the reassurance she needed. By sunrise, the small town of Willow Creek buzzed with the news of Maggie and Scout's late-night heroics. Word spread like wildfire, thanks to a passerby who'd shared the story on social media. Within hours, Scout's name was on everyone's lips, and Maggie's phone was ringing nonstop. It wasn't long before neighbors began showing up at Maggie's doorstep. They brought an array of thoughtful gifts: homemade cookies, dog treats, bouquets of flowers, and even freshly baked pies. For Scout, there were toys, personalized collars, and bags of his favorite kibble. One family presented Maggie with a beautifully engraved plaque that read, "To Scout, the protector of Willow Creek. Thank you for keeping us safe." Maggie's eyes misted over as she held the plaque, running her fingers over the polished surface. The doorbell seemed to ring every few minutes. Children came in groups, clutching colorful handmade cards adorned with crayon drawings of Scout. One little boy with wide, curious eyes approached Scout hesitantly, holding out a drawing of Scout standing tall with a superhero cape. "Thank you for keeping us safe," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Scout, sensing the boy's shyness, leaned down to nuzzle his small hand. The boy's face lit up with delight, and he threw his arms around Scout's neck in a hug. Maggie watched, her heart swelling with pride. As the day went on, the local news station arrived to interview Maggie. The reporter, a young woman with an eager smile, set up a camera on Maggie's porch. "Miss Williams," she began, "can you tell us what happened last night?" Maggie recounted the events, her voice steady and calm, though the memories of the tense moments still lingered. "Scout did what he's trained to do," she said. "He protected me just like he's always done. I'm just grateful he was there." When the reporter turned her attention to Scout, Maggie chuckled. "He doesn't do interviews," she said, patting his head. Scout wagged his tail, as if understanding the attention was for him. The reporter laughed, and concluded the segment, dubbing Scout Willow Creek's guardian. Throughout the day, Maggie's porch became a hub of activity. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers stopped by to express their gratitude. Each time, Scout greeted them with a calm and dignified demeanor, his presence offering reassurance. By evening, the town's mayor arrived with a proclamation in hand. Standing on Maggie's porch, he announced, "Today, we honor Scout for his bravery and service to our community. Let his actions remind us of the courage and loyalty that protect us every day." Applause erupted from the gathered crowd. Maggie beamed as she looked down at Scout, who remained by her side, his tail wagging slightly. As the crowd began to disperse, Maggie knelt beside Scout and whispered, "You're not just my hero, Scout. You're everyone's hero." Scout's ears perked up, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed like he was smiling. That night, as Willow Creek settled into peace, Scout's legacy as a protector had firmly taken root in the hearts of its people. Weeks had passed since that unforgettable night on Sycamore Lane. Life in Willow Creek had mostly returned to its quiet rhythm, but for Maggie and Scout, the echoes of that evening lingered in the form of newfound recognition and deeper connections with their neighbors. The gratitude and warmth of the community still resonated with Maggie, who cherished the letters and drawings sent by the townsfolk. One crisp morning, Maggie decided to take Scout for a walk along their usual route. As they turned on a Sycamore Lane, Maggie paused. The street lamp that had once illuminated a scene of danger now bore a small commemorative sign. Its polished surface gleamed in the sunlight and engraved in elegant script were the words, "Here, courage and loyalty stood tall." Maggie's breath caught as she read the tribute. She crouched down, placing a hand gently on Scout's head. "You've left a mark, old friend," she whispered. Scout, ever alert, wagged his tail, his bright eyes scanning the street as though remembering his moment of action. They continued their walk, passing by houses where neighbors waved from porches and children called out Scout's name. "There's the hero dog," one young girl exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. Scout responded with a dignified wag of his tail, his demeanor calm but clearly pleased by the attention. Maggie couldn't help but smile. Scout's story had not only brought the community closer, but had also sparked conversations about bravery, protection, and the special bond between people and their pets. He had become a symbol of courage for Willow Creek, a gentle reminder that heroes often come in unexpected forms. Later that afternoon, Maggie and Scout visited the local elementary school. The principal had invited them to share their story with the students as part of a lesson on bravery and kindness. Maggie stood at the front of the classroom, her hand resting on Scout's back. "Courage isn't just about being strong," Maggie began, her voice warm and steady. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And Scout here," she said, glancing down at her loyal companion, "has always been ready to protect those who need it." The children listened intently, their eyes wide as Maggie recounted the events of that night. When she finished, Scout stood up and padded to the front of the room, sitting tall. One by one, the children approached, their small hands reaching out to pat his fur. Scout accepted the attention graciously, his calm presence putting them at ease. As Maggie and Scout left the school, the principal handed Maggie a framed drawing made by the students. It showed Scout standing tall under the words, "Our hero." Maggie's heart swelled with pride. That evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Maggie sat on her porch with Scout at her feet. She looked out at the peaceful streets and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "You've done more than protect me," she said softly to Scout. "You've inspired us all." Scout gave a soft woof in response, his head resting on his paws. Though retired, he'd proven that true bravery and loyalty never fade. They endure, leaving a legacy that touches lives far beyond a single moment.